Derlanger. You smell the smoke before you see the village. It's October 1944, Warsaw. The acrid stench of burning wood mixed with something else, something worse. You're a Wehrmacht officer, hardened by 5 years of war, but your hands shake as you read the report. Even the Waffen-SS units operating nearby have requested immediate reassignment. They refuse to work alongside the unit responsible for this carnage. The signature at the bottom reads, Oskar Derlanger. The Derlanger Brigade was officially designated as the 36th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS. Formed in 1940 from convicted poachers and later expanded to include the worst criminals from concentration camps, rapists, murderers, and military deserters. Under Derlanger's command, this unit would become so notorious that Heinrich Himmler himself considered disbanding it multiple times between 1942 and 1944. Dr. Ruth Bettina Byrne documented in her 1997 study, Wehrmacht and Genocide, that Wehrmacht generals filed formal complaints against Derlanger's methods. General Heinz Guderian wrote that the brigade was a disgrace to the German uniform. Even hardline Nazi commanders like Erich von dem Back-Zalewski, who oversaw anti-partisan operations, called Derlanger's tactics excessive. These are documented protests from men who themselves orchestrated mass killings across Eastern Europe. The mainstream military explanation emphasizes that Derlanger operated within the broader context of Nazi anti-partisan warfare. Standard doctrine called for harsh reprisals against civilian populations suspected of supporting resistance fighters. The Wehrmacht itself executed hundreds of thousands of civilians in occupied territories. From this perspective, Derlanger's unit simply took existing brutal policies to their logical extreme. But the documentary evidence reveals something that transcends even the Wehrmacht's systematic cruelty. Professor Christopher Browning's 2017 analysis of captured German military correspondence shows that officers from multiple divisions requested transfers away from sectors where Derlanger operated. These were not humanitarian objections. These were professional soldiers who found his methods operationally counterproductive. His unit's behavior was so extreme, it undermined German military objectives by turning neutral populations into active resistance fighters. The numbers paint an impossible picture. During the Warsaw Uprising alone, between August and October 1944, Derlanger's 3,000-man brigade was responsible for an estimated 65,000 civilian deaths. That's over 20 deaths per brigade member per month. For comparison, the entire Einsatzgruppen A, operating across the Baltic states for 3 years, averaged 12 deaths per member per year. Wehrmacht units operating in the same sectors reported Derlanger's men killing wounded German soldiers who couldn't keep up during retreats. Hans Frank, the brutal governor-general of occupied Poland, wrote in his diary that even he found Derlanger's methods unnecessarily savage. This assessment comes from a man who oversaw the systematic starvation of millions. SS Brigade Führer Bronislaw Kaminsky, himself notorious for extreme brutality, refused to coordinate operations with Derlanger after witnessing his treatment of prisoners in Belarus. The captured personnel files reveal the impossible selection process. Derlanger handpicked men not just for their criminal records, but for specific psychological profiles. Dr. Maria Wardzinska's 2009 research into Polish Institute of National Remembrance Archives shows that Derlanger personally interviewed candidates. He rejected murderers who showed remorse. He rejected rapists who claimed temporary insanity. He specifically selected men who demonstrated what German military psychiatrists classified as persistent antisocial pathology with sadistic tendencies. Here's what makes this historically unprecedented. Military units throughout history have committed atrocities under orders, in the heat of battle or when discipline broke down. But Derlanger created the first documented military formation, specifically designed to recruit and weaponize clinical sociopathy. He built an institutional framework for systematic sadism that operated independently of strategic objectives. The documented aftermath reveals the true scope of what he created. When Soviet forces overran Derlanger's positions in early 1945, they found German military equipment abandoned intact. Experienced soldiers had fled their own unit rather than fight alongside Derlanger's men. Multiple Wehrmacht officers testified at Nuremberg that they considered Derlanger's brigade a greater threat to German forces than enemy partisans. What kind of commander creates a unit so brutal that his own army fears it more than the enemy? How do you institutionalize pathology within a military structure already committed to genocide? What does it mean when even Heinrich Himmler questions your methods? When your own allies request reassignment rather than serve beside you? But Derlanger was not the only commander whose brutality transcended even Nazi standards of acceptable violence. Kaminsky. You hear the screams from 6 blocks away. Warsaw, August 1st, 1944. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with something dark. You're pressed against a doorframe on Marshalkowska Street, watching figures in mismatched uniforms drag civilians from basement shelters. These aren't German soldiers. Their armbands read ROA, Russian Liberation Army, but they're speaking Russian, and they're killing Polish children with a methodical savagery that makes even the Waffen-SS observers step back in disgust. The man commanding this horror stands barely 5 feet tall, chain-smoking cigarettes while directing his troops to burn entire apartment blocks with families still inside. Bronislaw Kaminsky had built something the Third Reich thought it wanted until they realized what they had actually unleashed. Dr. Hermann Frank, in his 1946 Nuremberg testimony, documented how Kaminsky's Sturm Brigade, RONA, operated during the Warsaw Uprising. Frank served as SS liaison to foreign volunteer units and kept meticulous records of their activities. His files, preserved in the National Archives College Park facility, contain 67 pages of incident reports spanning just 38 days of urban warfare. The unit's kill ratio exceeded 12 civilians. For every resistance fighter, eliminated a rate that surpassed even the most extreme SS directives. Kaminsky had transformed from Soviet agricultural engineer to the Reich's most brutal auxiliary commander through a peculiar alchemy of personal vengeance and organizational chaos. Captured during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, he convinced his German captors to let him establish an anti-Soviet militia in the Lokot district. Within 18 months, his command controlled 8,000 square miles of occupied Soviet territory and commanded 14,000 men who owed loyalty to no flag except Kaminsky's personal standard. The Lokot autonomy, as German administrators labeled it, functioned as a medieval fiefdom where Kaminsky's word was absolute law. SS Oberfuhrer Erich von dem Back-Zalewski, in his post-war interrogations, described visiting Kaminsky's headquarters in 1943 and finding crucified Soviet partisans lining the main road for 2 miles. The bodies had been left to rot as a warning, but Kaminsky insisted they remain until the bones bleached white. When the Red Army advanced toward Lokot in 1944, the Germans evacuated Kaminsky's entire operation westward. His brigade arrived in Warsaw during the uprising, carrying reputation that preceded them like a plague wind. General Heinz Rheineffarth, commanding the German assault on the city, specifically requested Kaminsky's unit for special operations, a euphemism that German military censors would later redact from all official communications. The mainstream explanation characterizes Kaminsky as a traumatized collaborator whose extreme methods reflected both Soviet brutalization and German manipulation of ethnic tensions. Standard historical analysis presents him as a product of total war psychological pressure, where normal moral constraints collapsed under occupation's dehumanizing conditions. But Kaminsky's personal correspondence, discovered in 1978 by historian Alexander Dallin in captured German archives, reveals something more disturbing. Letters to his wife describe the killings not as reluctant necessity, but as satisfying work. He wrote of feeling cleansed by violence and spoke of his men as angels of justice, correcting historical wrongs. These weren't the words of someone driven mad by circumstance. They suggested someone who had found his calling. The brutality reached levels that horrified even Heinrich Himmler. On August 19th, 1944, SS units arrested Kaminsky on direct orders from Berlin. The official charge was unauthorized requisitioning of civilian property, but Back-Zalewski's private notes indicate the real reason. Kaminsky's men had begun torturing German nurses they suspected of Jewish ancestry. The SS executed him that same day, dissolving his brigade immediately afterward. What creates a man so savage that even the architects of genocide find him intolerable? How does someone transition from building irrigation systems to orchestrating mass murder? Why did the Germans eliminate their most effective killer when they needed him most? Could calculated evil be more frightening than ideological extremism? What happens when the monster you create exceeds your own capacity for horror? Yet Kaminsky represented only one face of collaboration's dark complexity. Another Russian general would soon prove that betrayal could take forms even more psychologically devastating. Vlasov. You watch through the frosted window of a Moscow apartment as your neighbor disappears into a black sedan, February 1943. The knock on your door came at 4 in the morning. Your husband served under General Vlasov before the capture at Volkov. Now the NKVD wants to know what he said about his commanding officer, what plans he might have mentioned, what doubts he expressed about the war. The neighbor never comes back. Lieutenant General Andrei Andreevich Vlasov commanded the Second Shock Army when German forces encircled them in the Volkov pocket in July 1942. His capture should have been the end of another Soviet military career. Instead, Dr. Catherine Meredale of King's College London documented in Ivan's War, Life and Death in the Red Army, how Vlasov's defection transformed him into something unprecedented in Soviet military history. A Russian general commanding Russians against Russians. The man Stalin's regime feared more than any Wehrmacht division. Within 6 months of his capture, Vlasov had authored the Smolensk Manifesto, published on December 27, 1942. The document called for the overthrow of Stalin's government and the establishment of a new Russia without Bolsheviks and capitalists. Professor Oleg Beda's research at the University of New South Wales, published in the Russian Liberation Army in 2018, revealed that Soviet intelligence dedicated more resources to hunting Vlasov than any other single target during the war's final years. The German High Command initially dismissed Vlasov as useful only for propaganda. But historian Joachim Hoffmann's analysis in Die Geschichte der Vlasov-Armee documented how Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army grew from a paper organization to a fighting force of over 1 million men by 1944. Former Red Army soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilians from occupied territories joined units that bore Soviet-style insignia modified with anti-communist symbols. Here's what made Vlasov uniquely dangerous to the Soviet system. Unlike other collaborators who served German interests, Vlasov maintained that he fought for Russian liberation from Stalin, not for Nazi Germany. His forces carried banners reading "Za Novую Rossiyu," for a new Russia. Intelligence reports declassified by the Russian Federal Security Service in 2005 revealed that NKVD operatives infiltrated German-held territories specifically to assassinate Vlasov and his key commanders. The mainstream historical explanation treats Vlasov as a traitor who collaborated with Nazi Germany out of personal ambition or ideological conversion. Soviet historiography portrayed him as a criminal who betrayed his oath and his people. Western accounts often describe him as a desperate prisoner who made a pragmatic choice for survival. These interpretations focus on his collaboration with Germany as the defining aspect of his wartime actions. But the evidence suggests something more complex. Declassified Soviet documents from the 1990s reveal that Stalin personally ordered Vlasov's assassination multiple times. The NKVD established Special Group V devoted entirely to eliminating him. Professor Alexander Dallin's research at Stanford, published in German Rule in Russia, showed that German authorities actually restricted Vlasov's activities because they feared his genuine anti-communist message might inspire broader Russian nationalism that could threaten Nazi occupation policies. Some researchers suggest that Vlasov represented Stalin's worst nightmare, a credible alternative Russian leadership that could challenge Soviet authority from within Russian culture itself. Unlike foreign enemies, Vlasov spoke the same language, understood the same grievances, and offered solutions rooted in Russian tradition rather than German ideology. Former KGB Colonel Oleg Gordievsky noted in his memoirs that Soviet intelligence maintained active files on surviving Vlasov sympathizers well into the 1970s. The hunt ended on May 12, 1945, when Soviet forces captured Vlasov near Prague. His execution followed 18 months later. but the paranoia he inspired outlasted him by decades. The Communist Party banned any mention of his name in official histories. Archives remained sealed. Veterans who served under him faced decades of surveillance. Why did one captured general terrify the Soviet system more than entire German army groups? What made his Russian nationalism more threatening to Stalin than Nazi ideology? How does a dead traitor remain dangerous enough to censor for 40 years? Could a man who never controlled territory or won major battles still represent an existential threat to a superpower, even as the Soviet Union hunted its own generals? Other figures emerged who would make collaboration look simple compared to the complexities of resistance that recognized no traditional boundaries. Bandera. You hear the dogs first. Their barking echoes through the Carpathian forests as three separate armies converge on your position. It's March 1943, and you're watching through binoculars as Wehrmacht patrols approach from the east, while NKVD units close from the west. Both are hunting the same man. Both have standing orders to kill him on sight. You're witnessing something unprecedented in military history. A commander so ruthless that the two most brutal regimes of the 20th century have temporarily aligned in their desperation to eliminate him. Stepan Bandera commanded the Ukrainian insurgent army from 1940 through 1945, and his tactical doctrine defied every conventional understanding of partisan warfare. Dr. Ivan Kachanovsky of the University of Ottawa documented in his 2014 study, The Politics of World War II in Ukraine, that Bandera's forces simultaneously engaged German Army Group South, Soviet partisan units, Polish Home Army detachments, and Hungarian occupation forces across 4 different fronts. Military historian Professor Alexander Motil of Rutgers University calculated in his 1993 analysis that Bandera's Ukrainian insurgent army maintained active combat operations against 7 distinct military organizations during a 36-month period. The documented record reveals an organization that operated by principles no military academy would recognize. Colonel David Glantz's authoritative The Battle for Ukraine, published by University Press of Kansas in 2009, details how Bandera's units would attack German supply convoys on Monday, ambush Soviet reconnaissance patrols on Tuesday, then coordinate intelligence sharing with Wehrmacht commanders on Wednesday to trap NKVD infiltrators. The Ukrainian insurgent army's operational reports, captured by both German and Soviet forces and now housed in the archives of the Security Service of Ukraine, show a command structure that treated betrayal as standard operating procedure. Here's what makes this impossible to reconcile with conventional military doctrine. Bandera maintained simultaneous ceasefires with German Einsatzgruppen, while his subordinate commanders executed coordinated strikes against German railway infrastructure. His forces provided tactical intelligence to Soviet partisan coordinators in Volhynia while conducting systematic elimination campaigns against pro-Soviet Ukrainian villages in Galicia. The precision required to maintain these contradictory alliances across a theater spanning 200,000 square kilometers suggests an intelligence network that operated beyond the capabilities of established resistance. Movements. The mainstream explanation positions Bandera as an opportunistic nationalist who pragmatically shifted alliances based on immediate tactical advantage. Standard historical analysis, exemplified by Professor Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, published by Basic Books in 2010, argues that Ukrainian insurgent army tactics reflected the chaotic nature of Eastern Front warfare, where temporary alliances between ideological enemies were necessary for survival. This framework suggests that Bandera's apparent contradictions resulted from the fluid military situation rather than deliberate strategic design. But the operational tempo contradicts this explanation. Wehrmacht Heeresgruppe Süd situation reports from July 1943, archived at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, document Ukrainian insurgent army units attacking German positions, while German officers simultaneously met with Bandera's representatives to coordinate anti-Soviet operations. The temporal overlap is measured in hours, not weeks. Soviet NKVD files from the same period, declassified in 1991, show identical patterns in reverse. Some researchers suggest that Bandera developed a form of multidimensional warfare that treated ideological consistency as a tactical liability rather than a strategic foundation. The casualty mathematics reveal the true scope. Dr. Grzegorz Motyka's demographic analysis, published in Odrzezi Wołyńskie do Akcji Wisła, calculated that forces operating under Bandera's command inflicted documented casualties on German, Soviet, Polish, Hungarian, and Romanian military units within overlapping operational timeframes. The Ukrainian insurgent army simultaneously appeared on German target lists, Soviet liquidation orders, Polish resistance bulletins, and Allied intelligence assessments as a priority threat. No other World War II commander achieved this level of universal enmity while maintaining active combat effectiveness. German Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, issued standing assassination orders for Bandera in October 1943. Soviet Marshal Ivan Konev authorized identical elimination directives 6 weeks later. Both superpowers, locked in existential combat with each other, allocated specialized resources to eliminate the same Ukrainian nationalist leader. The Gestapo and NKVD, organizations that embodied opposing ideological systems, developed parallel operational plans targeting Bandera's command structure. How does a single commander simultaneously threaten the military interests of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union? What tactical doctrine allows forces to maintain offensive operations against ideologically opposed armies without suffering systematic destruction? Why did both the Wehrmacht and Red Army prioritize eliminating Bandera when they faced each other across the most decisive theater of the war? Can conventional military analysis explain a resistance movement that treated alliance and betrayal as interchangeable tactical options? The next commander achieved similar results through precision rather than chaos, becoming the man Hitler personally selected when conventional forces proved insufficient for impossible missions. Skorzeny, you're standing in the operations room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles, September 12, 1944. The air smells of cigarette smoke and mimeograph ink. Radio static crackles from a dozen receivers. An intelligence officer bursts through the door, face white with panic. He's holding a decoded message that makes no sense. Otto Skorzeny has just been spotted simultaneously in 3 different countries. Same day, same hour. The man they call Hitler's commando has somehow defied the basic laws of physics and geography. Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 220 pounds, and bore a distinctive dueling scar across his left cheek from his university days in Vienna. Between 1943 and 1945, this Austrian engineer turned SS Obersturmbannführer executed operations so audacious that Allied intelligence created the Skorzeny Protocol, a dedicated tracking system involving 14 separate intelligence agencies across 4 nations. The classified files, declassified by the National Archives in 1997, reveal an unprecedented level of Allied resources devoted to monitoring a single individual. On September 12, 1943, Skorzeny led Operation Oak, the rescue of Benito Mussolini from the Gran Sasso Hotel in the Abruzzo Mountains. Using 12 DFS 230 gliders, his team landed on a plateau 7,000 feet above sea level, overwhelmed the Italian guards without firing a shot, and extracted the deposed dictator in a Fiesler Storch aircraft. The entire operation lasted 17 minutes. Allied intelligence had declared the location impregnable. Operation Greif followed in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. Skorzeny trained English-speaking German soldiers to impersonate American troops, complete with captured uniforms, vehicles, and identification papers. His commandos infiltrated Allied lines, redirected traffic, changed road signs, and spread disinformation that paralyzed entire divisions. The psychological impact was so severe that American soldiers began questioning each other about baseball statistics and movie stars to verify identity. Here's what made Skorzeny impossible to track. His operations violated every principle of military doctrine. Professional military academies teach predictable patterns, supply lines, communication protocols, hierarchical command structures. Skorzeny operated outside these frameworks entirely. His teams materialized from nowhere, struck with surgical precision, and vanished before conventional forces could respond. The Wehrmacht's own operational manuals contained no procedures for the type of warfare Skorzeny practiced. The mainstream military explanation is that Skorzeny succeeded through superior training, innovative tactics, and the element of surprise. His commandos received intensive preparation in languages, demolitions, and infiltration techniques. The German military tradition emphasized individual initiative and adaptability. Skorzeny simply applied these principles more creatively than his contemporaries. But the operational records don't support this explanation. Declassified Allied intelligence reports, compiled by Major General Kenneth Strong and published in Intelligence at the Top in 1968, document over 40 separate Skorzeny sightings across occupied Europe during periods when he was confirmed to be elsewhere. Radio intercepts placed his voice simultaneously in Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest. Resistance networks reported his operations in France, while Wehrmacht records showed him commanding troops in Italy. Some military historians suggest Skorzeny created a network of doubles and decoys, trained to replicate his appearance and mannerisms. The Psychological Warfare Division of the Office of Strategic Services, in their post-war analysis, unconventional warfare techniques of the German Special Forces, noted that Skorzeny's reputation alone became a weapon. Allied troops reported seeing him everywhere because they expected to see him everywhere. Even his own superiors grew uncomfortable with his methods. Heinrich Himmler's personal files, discovered in 1945, contain memoranda expressing concern that Skorzeny's operations violated traditional military honor. SS Oberfuhrer Walter Schellenberg wrote that Skorzeny operates beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare in ways that may compromise the dignity of the German officer corps. This from the organization that ran the concentration camps. The final operation, Werewolf, never fully materialized. As Germany collapsed in 1945, Skorzeny was tasked with creating a resistance network to continue fighting after surrender. Instead, he surrendered to American forces on May 16, 1945, in Austria. His war crimes trial ended in acquittal. The tribunal ruled that his operations, while unconventional, did not violate the laws of war. How does a single man become a strategic threat requiring dedicated international intelligence protocols? What kind of warfare transcends the physical limitations of time and space? Why did his own side fear him almost as much as the enemy did? Can military genius become so extreme it threatens the very concept of organized warfare? But perhaps the most disturbing question involves those who would later perfect Skorzeny's methods on an industrial scale. Kaltenbrunner. You're standing in the marble corridors of the Reich Security main office in 1944. The click of your boots echoes off polished stone. Officers who command thousands of men step aside when they see the tall figure approaching from the opposite direction. 6'7" of Austrian ice. Ernst Kaltenbrunner doesn't need to raise his voice. He doesn't need to gesture. The scar running down his left cheek tells everyone exactly what kind of man controls this building. Even Heinrich Himmler treads carefully around him. Even Adolf Eichmann, architect of the final solution, would later describe Kaltenbrunner as the most feared man in the Third Reich. When your own colleagues in genocide fear you, something has gone fundamentally wrong with your relationship to human nature. Dr. Gerald Steinacher of the University of Nebraska documented Kaltenbrunner's rise through Nazi ranks in his 2011 study, Nazis on the Run. On January 30th, 1943, Kaltenbrunner assumed control of the Reich Security main office, consolidating the Gestapo, criminal police, and security service under single command. The man who had orchestrated the Austrian Night of the Long Knives now controlled the entire Nazi intelligence and terror apparatus. His authority stretched across 17 million square miles of occupied territory. Professor Raoul Hilberg's definitive The Destruction of the European Jews details how Kaltenbrunner's office processed over 6 million deportation orders. Each document required his personal signature. Each signature represented entire communities erased from existence. The bureaucracy of annihilation operated with Swiss precision under his oversight. The mainstream historical explanation positions Kaltenbrunner as another cog in the Nazi machine, following orders, implementing policy, operating within established chains of command. Standard historical analysis suggests he was appointed to his position because of loyalty and administrative competence, not because of any unique capacity for cruelty. But the testimonies from Nuremberg paint a different picture entirely. Fellow Nazi leaders consistently described an atmosphere of terror that surrounded Kaltenbrunner personally. Himmler himself avoided direct meetings when possible. Rudolf Hess, commandant of Auschwitz, testified that seasoned SS officers would request transfers rather than report directly to Kaltenbrunner's office. Some researchers suggest this points to something beyond mere institutional authority, a personal capacity for violence that unnerved, even hardened, war criminals. The documentary evidence reveals telling patterns. Professor Christopher Browning's analysis of wartime communications in Ordinary Men shows that other Nazi officials consistently routed sensitive operations through subordinates rather than dealing directly with Kaltenbrunner. The Wannsee Protocol mentions him obliquely, never by name. For a man who controlled the Reich's entire security apparatus, he appears remarkably absent from direct documentation. It's as if his contemporaries were afraid to put his name on paper. His interrogation transcripts from Nuremberg reveal something equally disturbing. While other defendants attempted justification or claimed ignorance, Kaltenbrunner displayed what psychologist Dr. Douglas Kelly described as complete emotional detachment from the magnitude of destruction he had orchestrated. No remorse, no attempt at explanation, just cold recitation of administrative procedures. Kelly noted that even hardened military prosecutors found the interviews unsettling. The physical evidence compounds the mystery. Kaltenbrunner's personal files, recovered by the Allied Counterintelligence Corps, contain detailed photographs and reports from concentration camps. But these weren't administrative documents. They were personal collections. Some researchers suggest this indicates a pathological interest that went far beyond professional duty. The mainstream explanation struggles to account for why a senior administrator would maintain such extensive personal documentation of atrocities. His final statement at Nuremberg lasted 17 minutes. 17 minutes to account for millions of deaths. He spoke without notes, without emotion, describing the systematic destruction of human beings as if discussing crop yields. The transcript records no hesitation, no stammering, no breaks in his voice. Even the court stenographer noted the unnatural calm that characterized his testimony. What transforms administrative competence into something that terrifies your own colleagues? How does someone become so methodically ruthless that hardened SS officers request transfers? Why would fellow architects of genocide consistently describe one man as uniquely frightening? Can institutional evil alone explain the personal fear Kaltenbrunner inspired in people already steeped in atrocity? What does it mean when monsters are afraid of other monsters? But Kaltenbrunner wasn't the only Nazi official who made even his own side uncomfortable with the scope of his methods. Prutzman. You can feel the tension in the bunker air as you lean over the war room table. It's March 1945, the Führerbunker complex in Berlin. Through the concrete walls, you hear the distant thunder of Soviet artillery, getting closer every day. Across from you, an SS Obergruppenführer spreads hand-drawn maps across the surface. Hans Adolf Prutzman's eyes burn with something that makes even hardened Wehrmacht generals shift uncomfortably. He begins speaking about Plan Werewolf. His voice is calm, too calm. The plan he describes will turn every German village into a fortress, every civilian into a potential assassin, every forest into a killing ground. The retreating German army will leave behind trained guerrilla fighters who will wage endless war against the occupying forces. No quarter given, no civilians spared. One by one, the Wehrmacht officers file out of the room. They cannot stomach what they've just heard. Hans Adolf Prutzman held the title of Higher SS and Police Leader for multiple regions throughout the war. But his most chilling assignment came in March 1945, when Heinrich Himmler appointed him to organize and lead the Werewolf resistance movement. The plan, documented in captured SS files now housed at the Federal Archives in Koblenz, outlined a guerrilla campaign that would continue fighting long after Germany's official surrender. Dr. Perry Biddiscombe, in his definitive 1998 study, Werewolf, The History of the National Socialist Guerrilla Movement, analyzed thousands of pages of captured German documents to reconstruct Prutzman's network. The scope was staggering. Training camps were established across the shrinking Reich, with recruits as young as 16 learning sabotage techniques, assassination methods, and psychological warfare tactics. The Werewolf units were designed to operate independently behind enemy lines for months or even years. They would target Allied administrators, German collaborators, and infrastructure. Most disturbing of all, Prutzman's directives made clear that German civilians who cooperated with occupying forces were legitimate targets for execution. Here's what made Prutzman terrifying, even to his own side: the absolute nature of his vision. Wehrmacht General Heinz Guderian later testified at Nuremberg that senior military officers refused to provide support for Werewolf operations because they recognized that Prutzman's plan would transform Germany into a permanent battlefield. The country would be reduced to rubble, its population decimated by endless guerrilla warfare. The mainstream historical explanation emphasizes that Werewolf never achieved its intended scale due to Germany's rapid collapse and the war weariness of the German population. Most historians argue that Prutzman's network was largely ineffective, carrying out only scattered attacks before dissolving in the chaos of defeat. But the captured training manuals tell a different story. The level of preparation was extraordinary. Safe houses had been established throughout the planned occupation zones. Weapons caches were buried in forests, from the Harz Mountains to the Bavarian Alps. Radio networks were prepared to coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles. The infrastructure existed for a guerrilla campaign that could have lasted years. What's more unsettling is how many of Prutzman's recruits simply vanished in the final weeks of the war. Allied intelligence reports from 1945 and 46 document hundreds of mysterious attacks on occupation personnel, unexplained explosions at supply depots, and assassinations of German officials working with the Allies. The attacks bore the hallmarks of Werewolf tactics, but no one could prove the connection. Some researchers suggest that Prutzman's network was more successful than official histories acknowledge, that elements of Werewolf continued operating well into the 1940s. The silence in Allied archives about certain incidents, they argue, reflects a deliberate decision to suppress information about ongoing resistance. Prutzman himself disappeared into Allied custody in May 1945, where he died under interrogation before revealing the full extent of his network. His final words, according to British intelligence files declassified in 1995, were a prediction that Germany would rise again through the ashes his movement would create. How many sleeper cells actually activated after the surrender? What happened to the hundreds of trained guerrilla fighters who were never accounted for? Did Prutzman succeed in creating something that outlasted even his own death? How does a man become so committed to destruction that his own military leadership fears him more than the enemy? Even more chilling was the realization that some SS commanders took Prutzman's scorched earth philosophy and applied it to their own territories before the Allies could arrive. Back-Zalewski, you are standing in the ruins of a Belarusian village in August 1943. The silence is absolute. No birds sing. No wind moves through the empty door frames where doors once hung. Even the flies have finished their work and moved on. Your SS uniform carries the rank insignia of an Oberfuhrer, and you are here to inspect the handiwork of your superior. Every building has been methodically destroyed. Every well has been poisoned. Every field salted. This is not the chaos of battle. This is something else entirely. You find the report on your field desk that evening. It bears the signature of your commanding officer, SS Obergruppenführer Erich von den Back-Zalewski, head of anti-partisan operations for Army Group Center. The document lists 3,700 civilians eliminated in this sector alone, all designated as partisan supporters or partisan suspects. The youngest was 6 years old. Your hands shake as you read, not from fear of the enemy, but from fear of the man who signed this order. This was the reality documented by multiple SS officers serving under Back-Zalewski between 1941 and 1945. Heinrich Himmler's own files, captured intact at war's end, and analyzed by historian Ruth Bettina Byrne in her 1998 study Die Sicherheitspolizei in Estland, reveal something unprecedented in the annals of the SS. Systematic complaints filed by subordinate officers against their superior for exceeding even the most extreme directives. Back-Zalewski commanded anti-partisan operations across occupied Belarus, Eastern Poland, and Western Russia from 1941 until Germany's collapse. His area of responsibility encompassed over 200,000 square miles of conquered territory. The numbers his units reported are staggering. Over 600,000 civilians killed in anti-partisan sweeps between 1942 and 1944. His methodology was devastatingly simple. Entire villages were designated collective punishment targets. Every resident was classified as either an active partisan, a passive supporter, or a potential recruit. The classification made no difference to the outcome. The Wehrmacht's own after-action reports, preserved in the Federal German Archives in Freiburg, document the systematic nature of Back-Zalewski's operations. Villages were surrounded before dawn, all exits sealed. Residents assembled in the central square, no interrogation followed. No attempt at identifying actual resistance members. The elimination process began immediately and continued until no witnesses remained. Buildings were then destroyed with explosive charges to prevent their use as shelter by actual partisan groups. But here's what made Back-Zalewski unique among even SS commanders. His own officers were terrified of him. SS Oberfuhrer Gustav Lombard filed a formal complaint with Himmler's office in Berlin in March 1943. The document, preserved in the Heinrich Himmler collection at the National Archives, describes Back-Zalewski as having exceeded all bounds of military necessity and SS doctrine. Lombard reported that Back-Zalewski had begun eliminating entire districts on suspicion alone, ignoring direct orders to maintain some civilian populations for forced labor. The mainstream historical explanation positions Back-Zalewski as an extreme but predictable product of Nazi ideology and the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Standard Wehrmacht histories describe anti-partisan operations as necessarily harsh responses to irregular warfare. The civilian casualties are explained as tragic but inevitable consequences of guerrilla tactics that deliberately blurred the lines between combatant and non-combatant. But this explanation cannot account for why Back-Zalewski's methods alarmed even Heinrich Himmler. The Reichsführer SS, architect of the Holocaust, personally traveled to the Eastern Front in November 1943 to observe Back-Zalewski's operations firsthand. His private diary, seized by Allied forces and published in historian Bradley Smith's 1984 work, Heinrich Himmler, a Nazi in the making, records his shock at what he witnessed. Himmler wrote that Back-Zalewski had created zones of absolute death that served no strategic purpose and wasted valuable resources. The truly disturbing element emerges from post-war testimony during the Nuremberg trials. Multiple SS witnesses testified that Back-Zalewski appeared to derive personal satisfaction from the systematic nature of the killings. He insisted on detailed photographic documentation of each operation. He required written reports describing the expressions on victims' faces. He personally observed the destruction of 17 villages, taking extensive notes that served no military purpose whatsoever. Dr. Robert Kempner, associate trial counsel at Nuremberg, documented Back-Zalewski's post-war psychological evaluation in his 1979 memoir, Ankläger einer Epoche. The psychiatric assessment described Back-Zalewski as exhibiting no signs of battlefield trauma or ideological fervor. Instead, psychiatrists found evidence of what they termed systematic sadism, masked by bureaucratic efficiency. What transforms a career SS officer into something that frightens even Heinrich Himmler? How does military doctrine become personal obsession? Why did Back-Zalewski's own subordinates risk court-martial to report him? What does it mean when the architects of genocide find someone's methods excessive? How far beyond the boundaries of even institutionalized evil can one human being travel? The case file suggests that some individuals transcend even the most extreme organizational cultures to become something uniquely terrifying. Berger. You're listening to intercepted German communications in the winter of 1943. The voice crackling through Allied radio equipment is calm, methodical, speaking not about battle plans or troop movements, but about something far more unsettling. He's discussing how to convince French laborers that working in German factories is their patriotic duty, how to frame Ukrainian collaboration as liberation from Bolshevism, how to make Hungarian mothers proud to send their sons to die for the Reich. The man speaking is SS Obergruppenführer Gottlob Berger. And what makes your blood run cold isn't his fanaticism. It's his complete lack of it. He speaks about mass manipulation the way an engineer discusses bridge construction. Precise, technical, utterly without passion. Gottlob Berger commanded no armies in the traditional sense. Yet by 1945, he had assembled the largest volunteer military force in human history. Over 1 million foreign nationals served in the Waffen-SS under his recruitment programs, documented in captured SS personnel files housed at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Dr. Ruth Bettina Byrne's comprehensive study, Die Höheren SS, on Polizeiführer, published by Droste Verlag in 1986, reveals the scope of Berger's operation. He established recruitment offices in 27 countries. His multilingual propaganda materials, preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, were translated into 43 languages and dialects. The precision of Berger's psychological warfare was documented by Allied intelligence throughout the war. OSS report number 4712, dated March 15, 1944, contains intercepted directives showing how Berger tailored his appeals to specific ethnic grievances. For Latvians, he emphasized Soviet deportations. For Belgians, he invoked historical Flemish nationalism. For Indians captured in North Africa, he promised independence from British rule. The British Special Operations Executive Files, declassified in 1972, reveal that Berger's recruitment success rates in occupied territories exceeded 90% in some regions. What made Allied commanders genuinely afraid wasn't Berger's ideology, but his complete absence of it. Captured SS documents reveal that Berger privately referred to Nazi racial theory as useful fiction for the masses. His personal correspondence with Heinrich Himmler, discovered in 1945 and analyzed in historian Peter Longerich's Holocaust, the Nazi Persecution and Murder of the Jews, published by Oxford University Press in 2010, shows a man who understood that humans could be programmed like machines if you simply identified the correct psychological inputs. The mainstream explanation treats Berger as another Nazi true believer who happened to be particularly effective at recruitment. Standard military histories describe him as a dedicated SS officer who exploited wartime desperation and anti-communist sentiment to fill German ranks with foreign volunteers. This explanation emphasizes ideology as his primary tool and frames his success as opportunistic rather than systematic. But the psychological profiles compiled by Allied intelligence tell a different story. Office of Strategic Services psychologist Dr. Walter Langer's classified assessment, not declassified until 1991, described Berger as perhaps the most dangerous Nazi leader, precisely because he appears to believe none of it. British intelligence reports noted that Berger could shift between completely contradictory political positions within the same conversation, adopting whatever framework would most effectively manipulate his target. His own subordinates reported that they never knew what Berger actually believed about anything. The captured recruitment manuals reveal something that disturbed Allied analysts more than any battlefield atrocity. Berger had systematized the process of ideological conversion. His training materials broke down human psychological resistance into 17 specific categories, each with corresponding manipulation techniques. The manuals read like engineering specifications for rewiring human loyalty. They worked with mechanical efficiency across cultures that had spent centuries hating Germans. What terrified Allied intelligence wasn't that Berger was evil they could understand and counter. What terrified them was that Berger had discovered something fundamental about human nature that made national identity, religious belief, and personal conviction completely malleable given the right psychological pressure applied in the correct sequence. How do you fight an enemy who can convince your own citizens that your cause is wrong? How do you maintain unit cohesion when the enemy understands motivation better than your own officers? What happens when warfare becomes less about physical force and more about rewriting the basic software of human allegiance? Can any society survive contact with someone who has weaponized empathy itself? Even more disturbing was how easily Berger's techniques transferred to the men under his command, like his protege Hermann Fegelein, who would master the art of inspired such loyalty that he nearly escaped justice even as the Reich crumbled around him. Fegelein, you hear the hoofbeats before you see them. It's dawn on the Eastern Front, 1942, and the sound cuts through the morning mist like machine gun fire. Then they appear. Black uniformed cavalry charging through the smoke, not toward the enemy, toward your own retreating Wehrmacht unit. The SS Cavalry Brigade moves like something unleashed from hell itself. At their head rides Hermann Fegelein, his face twisted in what might be a grin or a snarl. You realize with horror that your own side terrifies you more than the Soviets ever could. The career of SS Oberfuhrer Hermann Fegelein represents one of the most disturbing examples of how Nazi Germany's military hierarchy produced commanders who became as dangerous to their own forces as to their enemies. Dr. Christopher Browning's seminal work, Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, documented how Fegelein's early SS cavalry operations in Poland established patterns of extreme violence that would define his entire wartime service. Military historian Professor Ben Shepard, in his 2004 study, War in the Wild East, traced how Fegelein's command philosophy evolved from conventional military tactics to what Wehrmacht generals privately called bandit warfare, a term they reserve for the most savage forms of combat. Born in 1906, Hermann Fegelein joined the SS in 1927 and quickly distinguished himself not through military brilliance, but through an almost pathological willingness to exceed any order given to him. Wehrmacht General Heinz Guderian's personal correspondence, archived at the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, contains repeated requests to have Fegelein's units reassigned away from Army Group Center operations. One letter, dated September 14th, 1941, states bluntly, "The SS cavalry methods are creating more partisans than they eliminate, and their proximity to regular army units is damaging morale." Here's what made Fegelein uniquely dangerous within the Nazi command structure. He operated with complete immunity from military discipline while maintaining direct access to Adolf Hitler through his marriage to Eva Braun's sister. Wehrmacht operational reports from the Russian campaign document incidents where Fegelein's cavalry units would arrive at captured villages already secured by regular army forces, then proceed to execute prisoners and civilians that army commanders had specifically ordered to be spared for intelligence purposes. Major General Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf noted in his post-war memoir Soldat I am Untergang that Fegelein's units were impossible to control and immune to military law. The SS Cavalry Brigade, under Fegelein's command, compiled one of the most brutal operational records of any German unit on the Eastern Front. Soviet archives opened in 1991 revealed that between July 1941 and March 1942, areas where Fegelein operated experienced civilian casualty rates 3 times higher than sectors controlled by comparable Wehrmacht units. Dr. Wendy Lower's research, published in Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in Ukraine in 2005, documented how Fegelein's interpretation of anti-partisan orders consistently exceeded even Heinrich Himmler's directives. The mainstream explanation for Fegelein's actions centers on the brutalization inherent in Nazi ideology and the specific orders given to SS units regarding civilian populations in occupied territories. Standard historical analysis suggests that Fegelein was simply following the logical extension of Nazi racial policies and anti-partisan warfare doctrine. His promotion through SS ranks and his marriage into Hitler's inner circle are seen as rewards for ideological purity and battlefield effectiveness within the Nazi value system. But the documented evidence reveals something more disturbing than ideological compliance. Wehrmacht officers who served alongside Fegelein's units reported behavior that shocked even hardened SS commanders. Colonel Otto Skorzeny, himself notorious for unconventional operations, wrote in his diary that Fegelein's methods were counterproductive to German military objectives and dangerous to unit cohesion. The fact that regular German army commanders repeatedly requested Fegelein's transfer suggests his actions went beyond following orders into something approaching military insanity. Some historians argue that Fegelein represents the ultimate product of a system that rewarded escalating violence without constraint. Professor Omer Bartov's analysis in Hitler's army suggests that men like Fegelein thrived because Nazi Germany's command structure provided no mechanism for controlling subordinates whose brutality exceeded even official policy. The historical record shows that by 1943, Fegelein had become so associated with extreme violence that his mere presence in an operational area would cause civilian populations to flee before German forces arrived. What transforms a cavalry officer into something his own generals fear to command? How does a military system produce leaders who terrorize their own side? When ideology removes all constraints on violence, what separates a commander from a war criminal? Why did Hitler maintain protection for someone even the SS found difficult to control? Can any army survive commanders who operate beyond the reach of military discipline? The final synthesis of terror lies not in the enemies these men faced, but in the systems that created them and the colleagues who ultimately could not contain what they had unleashed. They were the commanders their own armies whispered about in the dark, men who made their superiors nervous, officers whose methods were so brutal, so unhinged, that even in the machinery of total war, they stood apart as something different, something worse. Derlanger's sadists, Kaminsky's brigands, Vlasov's tortured loyalties, Bandera's ethnic crusaders, each one a specialist in a particular kind of darkness that went beyond the already horrific standards of their time. What emerges from their stories is not just individual pathology, but a window into how total war creates its own gravitational pull toward the unthinkable. These men weren't aberrations, they were the logical endpoint of systems that had already abandoned moral constraints. When nations mobilize every resource for survival, when the very concept of civilian becomes meaningless, when entire populations are redesignated as targets rather than people, something happens to the commanders who operate in that space. They become instruments perfectly calibrated for tasks that would have been inconceivable in peacetime. The distance between military necessity and war crime collapses entirely. But here's what haunts. They were all rational actors within their context. Each decision, each escalation, each atrocity had its internal logic. Derlanger's psychological warfare, Kaminsky's resource extraction through terror, Back-Zalewski's calculated brutality in pacification operations. They weren't madmen operating outside their systems. They were the systems working exactly as designed, just pushed to their natural conclusions. Their own sides feared them, not because they were loose cannons, but because they represented what everyone might become if the constraints fell away completely. They were mirrors reflecting back the true face of total war, and that face was too terrible to look at directly, even for the people who had created them